A black farmer strides confidently into an upscale airport showroom, his heart pounding with anticipation. This is the moment he has waited for, the day his dreams of owning a private jet might finally come true. But instead of admiration or respect, he is met with cold glares and murmurs of disbelief. The elegant showroom, with its gleaming aircraft and polished marble floors, is not accustomed to visitors like him. As Thomas, a hard-working farmer with years of toil etched into his sun-kissed skin, steps through the glass doors, conversations hush. Eyes dart toward him, scanning his worn-out checkered shirt, faded cap, and mud-stained boots. He can feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. But he ignores it. Today is not about them. Today is about fulfilling a lifelong ambition. Taking a deep breath, he walks toward the lineup of luxury aircraft. The gleaming surfaces reflect his determined gaze as he reaches out to touch the polished metal of a sleek jet. It feels surreal, like a dream he is only just beginning to grasp. But before he can even process the enormity of this moment, the atmosphere around him shifts. A sharp voice slices through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you?" The words, laced with skepticism, come from a sharply dressed salesman named Greg. His suit is pristine, his hair slicked back in an effort to exude superiority. His expression, however, betrays something far less professional, an air of disbelief that someone like Thomas would dare step into such an exclusive space. Thomas turns to meet Greg's piercing gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. "Yes, I'd like to inquire about this jet," he says evenly. Greg smirks, folding his arms across his chest. "You sure you're in the right place? These aren't tractors, you know." A chuckle ripples through a small group of onlookers who have gathered, their amusement barely concealed. Thomas doesn't flinch. He has faced worse than this. Years of struggle, of backbreaking work, of proving people wrong. He squares his shoulders and repeats, "I'd like to know more about this jet." Greg's smirk fades slightly, but he doesn't back down. "This particular model costs more than most people make in a lifetime," he says, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of number?" The murmurs around them grow louder. A woman near the reception desk leans toward her companion, whispering, "What's he doing here? He looks like he just walked off a farm." Another man, older with silver hair and an expensive watch, chuckles. "Maybe he's lost. Or maybe he thinks there's a lottery going on." Thomas hears it all. Every word, every snide remark. He lets their insults roll off him like rain on a tin roof. What they don't know is that he isn't here by accident. He isn't here on a whim. He has worked relentlessly, saving every penny, making sacrifices, and building an empire that few could comprehend. "I don't need to hear the price," Thomas finally says, his voice steady. "I just need to know where to sign." The room falls silent. Greg blinks, caught off guard. The amusement that had been simmering in his eyes vanishes. "Excuse me. You heard me," Thomas replies, his tone unwavering. "I've already done my research. I know what I want. Now, are you going to sell me this jet, or do I need to take my business elsewhere?" The sudden shift in power is palpable. The room, once filled with whispers and judgment, is now thick with tension. Some of the onlookers exchange uncomfortable glances, realizing they may have misjudged the man before them. Greg hesitates, his confidence faltering. He quickly glances at his colleagues, as if seeking reassurance. But the moment has already slipped from his grasp. Thomas is not here to play games. He is here to make a purchase. A senior salesman, having observed the exchange from afar, steps forward, sensing an opportunity where Greg saw only an obstacle. "Mr. Thomas, is it?" he asks, offering a genuine smile. "Why don't we discuss the details in my office?" Thomas nods, ignoring Greg entirely. As he walks past, he catches snippets of hushed conversations. "Wait, does he actually have the money? Who is this guy? I guess you can't judge a book by its cover. He doesn't need their approval. He never did." But as he follows the senior salesman into the office, he allows himself a small smile. Not because he's proven them wrong, but because he's proven himself right. Dreams are not defined by appearances. Success is not dictated by expectations. And respect, that is something earned, not given. As Thomas takes a seat, ready to finalize the deal, one thought lingers in his mind: this is only the beginning. Another employee intended to ask for more information about the airplane, but before he could speak, Greg, the staff member who had mocked Thomas earlier, reappeared, wearing a malicious smirk. Back again, Greg said, his tone dripping with condescension. What do you want this time? I thought we made it clear this isn't the place for you. These planes aren't just for looking at. Thomas stared at Greg without flinching. There was no anger in his eyes, only resolve. I'm not here just to look, he replied, his voice low and deliberate, emphasizing every word. Before he could continue, another sneer echoed from the corner of the room. Yeah, let him dream, a male voice said, louder this time. That's probably all he's good for. Thomas felt his chest tighten. His hands clenched, not out of rage, but in an effort to maintain control. He knew losing his temper would only confirm their belief that he didn't belong here. Yet every cutting remark was like a wave crashing against him, testing the limits of his composure. Even so, a spark of determination ignited within him. This wasn't anger but an unyielding resolve. He couldn't let their words define him or deter him. The real question was, how could he face this situation while preserving his dignity? That was the challenge he would have to confront with every step he took. He stood still, his gaze steady despite the growing jeers. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him as if they were waiting for him to crumble or walk away. Then, unexpectedly, he felt a gentle pat on his shoulder from behind. The gesture startled him just enough that he turned around, and there, standing before him, was a familiar face. Thomas. I didn't expect to see you here, said a warm and friendly voice, breaking the tense atmosphere. Standing before him was James, an old friend from high school. Like Thomas, James was also black, but his career had taken him down a different path. His neatly trimmed hair, expensive gray suit, and polished leather shoes sharply contrasted Thomas's simpler attire. Thomas stared at James for a few moments before exclaiming, "James. Is it really you?" A rare smile lit up his face, one that hadn't appeared all day. James smiled back, pulling Thomas into a friendly hug. His presence seemed to soften the tense atmosphere, though the scrutinizing eyes in the room hadn't yet turned away. "What are you doing here?" James asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and encouragement. "Don't tell me you're here to buy a plane." He chuckled lightly, but his eyes gleamed with respect rather than skepticism, something Thomas had yet to receive from anyone else in the room. Thomas hesitated briefly, a flicker of embarrassment creeping into his heart. He felt the stark difference between himself and James, not just in appearance but in how. James carried himself with such confidence in an environment like this, as if it belonged to him. Finally, Thomas answered honestly, "Actually, yes. I'm here to buy a plane. But it seems like nobody here believes I can." James glanced around at the people nearby, his expression sharpening. "The people here," he said firmly. "You don't need to worry about them. They don't understand you, and honestly, they don't matter." His voice was resolute but carried an undertone of encouragement. Thomas gave a slight nod, though unease still lingered in his eyes. "Didn't you hear what they were saying?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly. "The insults, the looks, they make me feel like I don't belong here." James placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and looked him straight in the eye. "Thomas, remember who you are. You've worked hard your entire life to get here. Their words don't define your worth, and they certainly can't stop you from achieving your dream." He paused, a smile returning to his face. "And I'm here to make sure you don't give up." James's words were like a small flame, igniting confidence within Thomas. He felt the warmth of friendship, a feeling he hadn't experienced during this long, pressure-filled day. The two friends chatted for a while, and Thomas felt some of the tension in his chest ease. Yet, James's presence seemed to draw increasing attention from those around them. From across the room, Greg stood with his arms crossed, his icy gaze fixed on the two friends. A faint smirk of disdain crept across his face. Greg wasn't just annoyed that Thomas was still here. James's arrival, with his evident success and self-assurance, only added to his irritation. "Looks like his friend is trying to act important too," Greg remarked to a colleague nearby, loud enough for others to hear. A few attendees began murmuring again, their scrutiny now expanding beyond Thomas to include James as well. Thomas noticed this and leaned closer to James, speaking softly. "You know, sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. Those looks, they make me feel like I'm standing on a battlefield I can never win." James shook his head firmly. "It's worth it, Thomas. No one gets to decide your dream except you. If you give up, that's when they win. But if you stand your ground and keep going, you'll prove them wrong. Thomas offered a faint smile, feeling as though a part of his strength had returned. Yet, he knew this challenge was far from over, not with Greg's piercing gaze or the venomous whispers still circulating around them. Even so, James's presence had rekindled his confidence. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now he no longer felt completely alone. Just as he was about to step away, a voice shattered the fragile silence. "Do you think you can buy an airplane dressed like that?" The man's voice boomed loud enough to make nearby customers turn their heads. He was middle-aged, dressed in an expensive gray suit and polished leather shoes. His smirk was laced with undisguised disdain. Thomas stopped, his shoulders tensing, but he didn't turn around immediately. The man, realizing he had the audience he wanted, continued in an even more mocking tone. "Seriously, just look at yourself. You should probably head back to your farm. That's where you belong." A few chuckles echoed throughout the showroom. A woman near the reception desk covered her mouth with her hand, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The mocking remarks fueled another wave of judgmental glances, as if the room was savoring a live drama. James frowned, stepping forward as if to intervene, but Thomas raised a hand to stop him. He knew his friend wanted to stand up for him, but this was a moment he needed to face on his own. Slowly, Thomas turned his head, his eyes meeting the older man's gaze directly. "If you have something to say to me, just say it," Thomas replied, his voice calm yet sharp. His words weren't loud, but they were piercing enough to silence the laughter around him. The man seemed taken aback by Thomas's retort but quickly regained his composure. "Straightforward, huh?" he sneered. "All right, I'll be blunt. You look completely out of place here. This is a place for people who can actually afford their dreams, not for wishful thinking." A few people nearby nodded in agreement, as if the man had voiced what they had all been thinking. But Thomas no longer cared about their opinions. He knew who he was, and he wasn't about to let them decide his future. As Thomas turned to leave, a sharp, mocking laugh cut through the air, stopping him in his tracks. The condescension in that laughter was unmistakable, its intent clear: to humiliate, to belittle, to remind him that in their eyes, he would never belong. He turned back slowly, his expression unreadable. The middle-aged man who had taunted him stood with arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. Greg, standing nearby, observed in silence, his smug satisfaction evident. The energy in the room was thick, charged with tension, as if everyone was waiting for Thomas to break under the weight of ridicule. "You're walking away already?" The man sneered, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I expected you to put up more of a fight. Guess I was giving you too much credit." Thomas inhaled deeply, feeling the heat rise in his chest, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing his frustration. Instead, he took a step forward, his posture unshaken, his tone measured. "Tell me," Thomas said, locking eyes with the man, "what exactly do you want me to prove?" The question, simple yet piercing, hung in the air. The man faltered for a split second before regaining his composure, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "You don't belong here," he said, shaking his head as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This isn't a place for dreamers who can't afford to back up their words. This is for real buyers. People with means. People who fit." A murmur ran through the showroom, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Thomas remained still, his fingers clenching at his sides. He'd heard variations of this sentiment his entire life, sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken outright. But always there, always present. James, sensing his friend's quiet fury, stepped forward. "And what exactly makes you think he doesn't belong?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. "Is it his clothes, his presence, or just the fact that you've decided he doesn't fit your mold?" The man scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Let's not turn this into something it's not," he said dismissively. "It's just reality. You can't fake success." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, one that lacked amusement but brimmed with certainty. "You're right," he said. "You can't fake success." With deliberate movements, Thomas reached into his pocket, retrieving a check. He held it up for all to see, the numbers on it clear and undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room as eyes darted toward the proof in his hand. The check reflected the full price of the aircraft he had been inquiring about. Silence followed, stretching long enough that even the faintest shuffle of feet could be heard. The man's smirk faded, replaced by disbelief. Greg's arms, which had been crossed in smug confidence, slowly fell to his sides. "This real enough for you?" Thomas asked, his voice calm yet searing. "Or would you like me to prove it another way?" The middle-aged man opened his mouth but found no words. His arrogance, so easy and sharp before, faltered under the weight of the moment. Greg, who had done everything to dismiss Thomas, now stood rigid, his discomfort plain for all to see. "You see," Thomas continued, taking his time as he let his gaze sweep over the gathered crowd, "it was never about whether or not I could afford it. It was about whether you thought I should be allowed to." James, standing beside him, folded his arms, watching as the energy in the room shifted. The whispers that had once been filled with mockery now carried a different tone: unease, regret, uncertainty. Greg finally cleared his throat, forcing a thin smile. "Sir, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot," he stammered, his previous bravado nowhere to be found. "If you're still interested in making a purchase, we'd be more than happy to assist you." Thomas studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, I don't think so," he said. "I'd rather do business with people who see me as a customer from the moment I walk in, not just when I prove I can pay." With that, he turned, walking away with James by his side. The silence behind him was thick with unspoken words, with shame left unacknowledged. But Thomas didn't look back. The weight on his chest, though not gone, felt lighter. He had spent his life proving himself, fighting to be seen, to be valued. Today, he had proven something not just to them, but to himself. As he stepped outside, the crisp air filling his lungs, he reached for his phone. He needed to make a call. Minutes later, Marcus arrived. Tall, broad-shouldered, his tailored suit immaculate, he moved with an air of quiet authority. His father's face was unreadable, but Marcus could feel the tension radiating off of him. "Dad," Marcus greeted, his voice steady. "What happened?" Thomas let out a slow breath. "Just another day," he said simply, though the heaviness in his tone suggested otherwise. Marcus looked toward the showroom, his sharp gaze sweeping over the faces inside. He recognized the look in their eyes. The guilt, the shame, the desperate attempts to avoid his gaze. Straightening his tie, Marcus stepped forward. The air in the room shifted once again as he entered, his presence commanding attention. He stopped at the reception desk, facing Greg. "Are you the manager?" he asked, his voice even but firm. Greg swallowed hard. "No, sir. Just a sales associate." "Then get me someone who actually runs this place," Marcus said coolly. "Because we need to talk." Greg hesitated, glancing at the other staff, but one look at Marcus's expression told him he had no choice. Moments later, the manager arrived, his demeanor professional but tense. "How can I help you?" he asked cautiously. Marcus took his time before answering, letting the moment settle. "I want to discuss the way my father was treated today," he said. "And what you plan to do about it." The weight of his words sank in, pressing against the manager, against Greg, against every single person who had watched and done nothing. For the first time since Thomas had walked into that showroom, they truly understood. Some lessons, after all, can't be ignored forever. Greg hesitated, struggling to find the right words as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. "We didn't mean any harm," he stammered, his voice barely steady. "Maybe it was just a misunderstanding." Marcus narrowed his eyes, his tone sharp and unwavering. "A misunderstanding? You mean to tell me that looking down on my father because of how he was dressed was a mistake? That assuming he didn't belong here was just an accident?" His voice carried through the room, cutting through the silence like a blade. Greg opened his mouth to reply but found himself at a loss. The room, once filled with laughter and judgment, now seemed unbearably quiet. The customers who had joined in the ridicule a few moments earlier suddenly found the floor or the walls far more interesting than Marcus's piercing gaze. "An apology needs to happen right now," Marcus continued, his words carrying an unmistakable weight. "If not, I promise you, this will not end here. I am a lawyer. My father wasn't just insulted, he was humiliated, disrespected, and discriminated against in a place that should serve all customers equally. If this company fails to acknowledge its wrongdoing, I will take legal action." Whispers rippled through the room, a wave of unease washing over everyone present. Greg swallowed hard, his face pale as he bowed his head slightly toward Thomas. Sir, I sincerely apologize if my words offended you. Thomas met Greg's eyes, his own expression no longer filled with anger but with a quiet strength. This apology isn't just for me, he said steadily. It's a lesson for you and everyone here. Treat every person with respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Marcus turned his attention to the others, his voice as firm as ever. And what about you? Did you think it was acceptable to mock my father, to laugh at him just because he didn't fit your idea of wealth? He scanned their faces, but no one dared to meet his gaze. The middle-aged man who had been the loudest before now mumbled something unintelligible, his arrogance fading into shame. One by one, customers made excuses and hurriedly left, unwilling to face Marcus's judgment. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. Marcus placed a firm hand on his father's shoulder. Come on, Dad. Let's go. They've seen enough. Yet inside, Marcus knew that this was bigger than one incident. This was about something deeper, about justice, about dignity, and about making sure no one else had to go through what his father had. The matter seemed settled when they walked out of the showroom, but for Marcus, it was far from over. He saw it not just as an insult but as a violation of his father's rights, a moment that demanded action. Weeks later, a lawsuit was officially filed against the aircraft showroom's parent company. The accusations were clear: discrimination, humiliation, and a failure to provide equal treatment to all customers. Thomas was at the center of the case, but Marcus led the charge, assembling a formidable legal team and gathering indisputable evidence. The first court hearing drew a packed courtroom. The company's representatives, their attorneys, and the employees involved, including Greg, were all present. Greg sat stiffly among the defense team, his face void of its previous smugness. Now, he looked tense, unsure, and defeated. Marcus stood before the court, his voice steady and powerful. Your Honor, he began, scanning the room, we are here today to bring to light a truth that many choose to ignore: discrimination still thrives in modern business environments. My father, Thomas, was not just insulted, he was singled out, humiliated, and made to feel unwelcome. No person should have to endure such treatment. The company's lead attorney stood quickly. Your Honor, we believe this case has been taken out of proportion. The remarks Mr. Thomas overheard were simply unfortunate misunderstandings, not an intentional act of discrimination. Marcus did not flinch. Misunderstandings. He let the word hang in the air before continuing. We have undeniable evidence that this was not a mistake, it was a deliberate attempt to belittle my father, and we will prove it. He signaled to Patricia, a young woman seated at the witness stand. She had been the only employee at the showroom to secretly record the incident, unwilling to stand by as her colleagues mistreated Thomas. Patricia, Marcus said, please recount what you witnessed. She took a deep breath, her eyes flickering to Greg, who now seemed to be shrinking into his seat. I saw everything, she stated firmly. Greg and several customers made outright discriminatory remarks toward Mr. Thomas. They judged him based on his clothing and ridiculed him. I recorded the conversation because I knew what was happening was wrong. Marcus nodded. Do you have that recording with you? She handed her phone to Marcus, who connected it to the courtroom's audio system. The moment the recording played, the entire room fell into an uneasy silence. You think you can afford a plane dressed like that? Go back to your farm. He probably thinks this place is a charity giveaway. The words rang through the room like gunshots, each phrase dripping with malice and prejudice. Faces turned pale, and an undeniable tension filled the air. Greg, unable to look anywhere but down, clenched his fists as if willing himself to disappear. The company's attorneys shifted uncomfortably, their argument crumbling before them. When the recording ended, Marcus stepped forward once more. Your Honor, he said, his voice resolute, this is not a misunderstanding. This is blatant discrimination, a direct attack on my father's dignity. And if this business is allowed to operate in such a manner, who's to say they won't do it again, to someone else? To another hard-working person who doesn't fit their narrow standards. The company's lawyer stood in a last attempt to salvage their case. Your Honor, we do not condone these remarks. However, the company itself cannot be held liable for the personal actions of individual employees or customers. Marcus's eyes darkened. The company created an environment where such behavior was tolerated, he countered. They never stepped in to correct it. They never held their employees accountable. If no one is responsible, then discrimination goes unpunished. And that, Your Honor, is unacceptable. The judge leaned forward, nodding slowly. The evidence presented is undeniable, he said gravely. This case will proceed to determine the extent of liability both on an individual and corporate level. What I have heard today is deeply troubling. Marcus turned to his father, whose eyes gleamed with silent pride. The battle was not yet won, but the course of justice had been set in motion. He vowed to see it through to the end, not just for his father, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The courtroom was heavy with silence as a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair stood, attempting to regain control of the rapidly slipping case. Your Honor, we do not deny that the remarks made were inappropriate. However, we firmly argue that this was an individual's action and does not reflect the company's values or policies. Marcus rose to his feet immediately, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Does not represent the company, he echoed, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. Your Honor, this is not an isolated event. This is an environment where such behavior is tolerated and even encouraged. Greg, the salesman, was not the only one to participate. His colleagues and customers in that showroom joined in, some with approving glances, others with laughter. This isn't just an individual act, it's a systemic problem. The company's lawyers fidgeted, their discomfort evident. One of them tried to intervene. We are willing to implement additional training and stricter oversight to prevent future incidents. Marcus didn't waver. Training alone is a convenient excuse. My father was not the first person treated this way, and unless real change happens, he won't be the last. This company must take full responsibility, not just for the words spoken, but for the silent complicity that allowed such behavior to thrive. The judge, an older woman with an authoritative presence, took a measured breath before addressing the room. The evidence presented today has made one thing clear, Mr. Thomas was subjected to outright discrimination in a business setting. This is not merely a case of poor customer service, this is a violation of fundamental human rights. Businesses have a duty to ensure that all individuals, regardless of appearance or background, are treated with respect and fairness. She turned her gaze toward the defense team. I advise you to reconsider your stance before we proceed. Do you wish to contest this further, or are you prepared to discuss a reasonable settlement? The company's legal representatives exchanged hurried whispers, their expressions betraying concern. Marcus remained steadfast, his tone unwavering. Your Honor, my father did not come here for a meaningless apology or surface-level reforms. He came to reclaim the respect and dignity that were stripped from him that day. And we won't stop until true justice is served. Silence fell over the courtroom as Greg sat motionless, his face devoid of color. The company's lawyers deliberated before one finally stood. We are willing to discuss settlement terms. The judge gave a firm nod. Very well. We will proceed with settlement discussions in the next session. However, should a fair resolution not be reached, this case will go to trial, and I will ensure that justice is served. Marcus turned toward Thomas, a quiet but victorious glint in his eyes. We're making progress, Dad, he whispered, his voice filled with conviction. But he knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't just about one incident, it was about setting a precedent. The final day of the trial saw a packed courtroom. Rows of spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers leaned forward, eager to witness the verdict of a case that had sparked public debate. Thomas and Marcus stood tall, their expressions calm but resolute. The judge entered, her presence commanding the room's attention. After a moment, she began. After a thorough examination of the evidence and testimonies, this court has reached a decision. It is evident that Mr. Thomas was subjected to degrading and discriminatory treatment in a professional setting. The recorded statements serve as undeniable proof of the culture of prejudice within the defendant company. Her gaze settled on the defense team, who shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. This behavior is not only unethical but also a direct violation of established anti-discrimination laws. The room was tense as the verdict was delivered. The court finds the defendant company liable for discrimination and harassment. The company is hereby ordered to pay $500,000 in damages. These funds will compensate Mr. Thomas and support initiatives promoting equality in business spaces. A murmur spread through the room. The hefty penalty was a clear statement that discrimination would not be tolerated. But the ruling didn't end there. Additionally, the judge continued, the company must implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees. This will be overseen by an independent regulatory body to ensure compliance. The intent is not just to correct past wrongs but to prevent such injustices from occurring again. Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he listened. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about change. He had fought not only for his father but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or excluded. The judge's final order was a decisive one. Furthermore, the company must issue a public apology to Mr. Thomas, both in writing and across media channels. A true apology is not just words, it is an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to change. The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of rustling papers as the judge finalized her ruling. Then, she raised her gavel. This court is adjourned. Thomas turned to Marcus, his eyes reflecting pride and gratitude. You did it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. This is justice, Dad. His words carried the weight of everything they had endured, and everything they had won. On the other side of the room, Greg slipped away quietly, his expression haunted. The company's legal team packed up their materials in silence, acutely aware that this verdict was more than a financial blow, it was a warning to businesses everywhere. As Marcus and Thomas stepped outside the courthouse, they were met with a sea of reporters and flashing cameras. But Thomas barely noticed. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he thought had been taken from him, dignity. He stood tall, unshaken. Beside him, Marcus looked out at the gathered crowd and spoke, his voice clear and unwavering. Justice is not a privilege, it's a right. And today, justice was served. The morning sunlight streamed through the airport showroom, gleaming off the polished exteriors of private jets on display. Stepping out of a sleek SUV, Thomas adjusted his suit, his polished shoes tapping confidently against the tiled floor. He was no longer the man in worn-out boots, dismissed and ridiculed. Today, he walked with the quiet confidence of a man who had reclaimed his respect. As he stepped into the showroom, returning to the very place where he had once been humiliated, every gaze in the room turned to him. This time, however, the looks weren't of judgment but of recognition. Marcus walked beside him, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet satisfaction. Today was different. Today, they weren't just seen. They were acknowledged. Thomas took in the room for a moment, then smiled. It wasn't about revenge. It was about proving that dignity could not be stripped away, that respect was not dictated by wealth or appearance. It was earned. And today, it was reclaimed. The moment Thomas stepped into the showroom, the air grew heavy with an unspoken tension. Employees who had once ridiculed him stood frozen, their gazes shifting awkwardly, avoiding his eyes. Greg, the ringleader of the mockery, stood behind the counter, his shoulders slightly hunched, a shadow of the arrogance he once carried. His confidence had crumbled, leaving behind only the remnants of discomfort and regret. When his eyes briefly met Thomas's, they quickly darted away, as if unable to bear the weight of his own past actions. Thomas walked steadily toward the center of the showroom, his steps measured and deliberate. Stopping in front of Greg and his former colleagues, he surveyed their faces. His expression remained calm, yet his presence alone carried a silent message of triumph. A faint smile curved his lips, not one of forgiveness, but of quiet victory. "Do you remember me?" Thomas's voice cut through the silence, deep and unwavering. The weight of his words settled over the room, and the only response was a series of hesitant nods. No one dared to speak. "The last time I walked out of here," he continued, his tone deliberate and pointed, "you laughed at me, mocked me, judged me based on my appearance. But today, I am not here to buy from you. I am here to remind you that prejudices and attitudes like yours do not define anyone's worth." Greg opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Thomas raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't need an apology," he said, his voice firm. "The court has already spoken for me. What I want you to remember is this: every customer who walks through that door deserves respect, no matter their appearance, their attire, or their background." Without another word, Thomas turned away, his gaze shifting toward a rival company's display across the showroom. Their logo stood tall and untainted by the past. A confident smile crossed his lips as he glanced at Marcus. "Let's go," he said. Together, they walked toward the competitors' section, where an employee greeted them with a warm and professional smile. There were no hesitant glances, no judgmental stares, only respect. "I'd like to see your finest planes," Thomas said, his tone exuding the authority of a man who made significant decisions. From behind, the employees of the original showroom watched in stunned silence. Expressions of embarrassment and regret shadowed their faces. Greg gripped the counter tightly, his head lowered, realizing that his prejudice had cost the company not only a valuable client but also its reputation. An hour later, Thomas emerged from the rival company's section, contract in hand. He had just finalized the purchase of the aircraft he had once dreamed of, the very plane he was mocked for aspiring to own. The victory, however, was not in the purchase itself, it was in the fact that he had done it on his own terms, proving that dignity and perseverance could never be undermined by shallow judgments. Before leaving, Thomas cast one last glance toward the original showroom. The people who had ridiculed him now stood silently, weighed down by their own remorse. He offered them a fleeting smile, not out of forgiveness, but as a final statement that he had risen above their pettiness. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the place that had once tried to diminish his worth. Above, the sky was clear and endless, mirroring the sense of freedom that Thomas felt deep within. The aircraft he had just purchased awaited him, gleaming under the sunlight. It was more than just a machine, it was a symbol of self-respect, perseverance, and triumph over prejudice. Seated inside the spacious cabin, Thomas gazed out the window, his heart swelling with pride. Beside him sat Marcus, the friend who had stood by him through it all. The aircraft's smooth ascent felt like a metaphor for their journey, one that had begun with injustice but ended with unwavering victory. The plane landed on familiar soil, where Thomas's family eagerly awaited his arrival. As he stepped out, his wife and children rushed forward, their faces glowing with pride and joy. His wife took his hand, her eyes shining with admiration. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with love and encouragement. His children, their eyes wide with awe, embraced him tightly, their small hands gripping his suit as if they never wanted to let go. In their innocent faces, he saw not just pride but an understanding of the lesson he had fought to teach the world, that respect and dignity were not privileges but rights that no one had the power to strip away. That evening, the Thomas family gathered around the dining table, laughter and conversation filling the warm air. They didn't just celebrate the purchase of a plane, they celebrated resilience, integrity, and the power of standing up against injustice. Thomas shared his experiences, speaking not of anger, but of lessons learned. He recounted the sneers, the dismissive words, the judgmental stares, and how he had met them all with steadfast determination. "I'm not a perfect man," Thomas said, his gaze meeting each of his family members. "But I have always believed this: no one has the right to define your worth except you. What I did wasn't just for my dream. It was to prove that we can rise above prejudice, as long as we never give up." Marcus, seated beside his father, nodded in agreement. "Injustice doesn't just happen," he added. "We have to stand up for it, fight for it, and never stay silent when we see wrong." Meanwhile, those who had wronged Thomas faced their own consequences. Greg, once the embodiment of arrogance, was no longer employed at the showroom. The company had been hit with substantial fines, forced to overhaul its policies, and subjected to court-mandated oversight. The lesson was not just in documents and reports but in the very fabric of their professional lives. Customers who had once joined in the mockery now bore a heavy burden of shame, their laughter replaced by deep reflection. But for Thomas, the journey wasn't about revenge, it was about change. His story became more than just his own, it became a lesson, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever faced discrimination or disrespect. He had fought, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been denied respect due to shallow judgments and outdated prejudices. As Thomas boarded his plane once more, he carried with him not just a contract or a successful purchase, but the knowledge that dignity and self-respect were worth every battle. The aircraft soared through the sky, not just as a means of travel, but as a testament to justice, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be defined by the narrow minds of others.